Alright everyone, so welcome to chapter 54, part 1. This chapter really focuses on your community ecology, so now we're starting to look at different species, how their interactions together really drive the survival or lack thereof of different species within our community structure. So remember that your community, in terms of a definition, is populations of various species. All right, so now we're not just looking at a species of palm trees in the picture, but the birds that are there, the other mammals that might live there, so on and so forth. So we're talking about various species living close enough together that their interactions are really going to affect the survival, the reproduction of the other organisms that they interact with. Okay? So, chapter 54, particularly here at the beginning, really focuses in on those interactions, such as your competition, your predation, your symbiosis, and how those interactions then affect the survival and reproduction of each species within that community. So, let's talk about some of those interactions. All right, we can talk about interspecific competition. So, competition for a specific resource that would be in short supply, aka it's some sort of limiting resource. And competition, in all respects, is going to be kind of a negative to negative relationship. So, it's going to be harmful to both species that have to compete over this resource. And depending on the strength of that competition, we can end up seeing ultimately competitive exclusion. So one organism is better adapt at competing for that particular resource, and so they're going to drive the other one out. All right, and that's really the principle behind competitive exclusion. Two species, they're competing for the same limiting resource, and because they both need that resource to survive in that area, they both can't exist in the same place. All right, so ultimately what we're talking about is that their niche, their job, if you will, within that environment is too similar for both of them to be able to exist in the same community at the same time. So, ecological niche, we're talking about an organism's uses of both biotic and abiotic resources within its environment. So, what's its role within that community? And what we find out is that when we start competing over the same resources, so these organisms have the same niche, one's going to be slightly better at gathering access to those resources, and so they are going to exclude the other. Okay? So, in order for different organisms to exist within that community, they have to have different roles. They have to have different niches. All right. Now, that doesn't mean I can't take one organism in one community who's got a particular niche and see a different species, different organism filling that role in a different community. All right, but you put them together, they're not going to be able to coexist. So, what's going to potentially happen to these organisms if they're competing for the same resource? Well, we've got a couple of options. All right. One thing we can see is that the organism completely gets excluded, it can't exist. But in some instances, we can have cases of what we call resource partitioning. So, slightly different niches, both organisms could exist across the entire role, the entire niche, but they have figured out a way to sort of coexist with each other, neither getting the full amount of resources it could use, and so there's sort of a compromise going on. So what are we really talking about? All right, well, there's a distinct difference between what we would consider a fundamental niche. All right, so the role or the access to resources that a particular species could have full reign over if it was the only one there, versus its realized niche, what space, what resources it's actually using, what niche it's actually occupying. So if we take a look at this experiment here, and your text goes into a little bit more detail, we've got two different species of barnacles, all right? And we're in the intertidal zone, so our Baliants, all right, here's its realized niche. These guys are up here, all right, but if we were to take away that competing species, these guys could have a fundamental niche all the way through, all right? But these guys are better adapted dealing with what's up here during high tide. These guys are a little more better adapted fulfilling the role down here, and so they've sort of partitioned those resources so that they can both exist in the same community. They're just not getting access to all that they could have if the other species wasn't there. Okay, so what we see is that very frequently the full range of a species niche isn't actually what we see in nature. All right, and that's all that that's really going into. Okay, so they've sort of made a compromise and taken, well, I'm better at this end, so I'll take this end of that role. You're a little better adapted at the other opposite end, so you take care of that. In other cases, we end up seeing character displacement. Essentially, this is evolution. All right, so we're looking at the tendency of different characteristics to diverge in populations that are both in this same community. Okay, so here's an example. We've got these finches, okay, and we're talking about the beak depth, okay, beak size of these finches in the Galapagos. And when these finches are on two different islands, all right, so they are what we would consider allopatric speciation, so they speciated, they diverged where they were geographically isolated, so they were not within the same community. Okay, they're completely separate geographically from each other. Their beak depths are relatively similar. Okay, but we stick them on the same island together, and all of a sudden, we're dealing with a sympatric speciation. All right, where we took that ancestral species and they had to diverge into two separate species in order to both survive together. Okay, so their beak depths are different because they now had to compete over the same resources, and so over time, all right, this guy got better at eating food sources that were better adapted to this beak length. This guy was better at getting foods at this beak length. All right, and so now we've diverged into those two separate species because of competition. Okay. So competition's one aspect of interactions between different organisms, predations another. Okay, so while competition is sort of harmful to both, they're both not getting the full amount of resources they potentially could without that competition. All right, predation's going to be a positive for our predator and obviously a negative for our prey species. All right, somebody's getting fed, all right, and that's obviously a benefit. I need to eat, I need to get those nutrients. Unfortunately, it comes at the expense of our prey organism who, well, dies. All right, and so everything ultimately is going to lead back to evolution. So, what sort of adaptations have our predators gained over the generations to ensure that they're good predators, good at catching their prey? A whole host of things. And I'm sure if you were to be asked to think of these, you'd come up with a lot of these yourself. All right, the claws, the teeth, the fangs, your stingers in something like the scorpion there, poisons. Okay, so a whole host of adaptations to ensure that they can get the prey that they need and ultimately get the resources, the nutrients that they need. So, alright, I've got claws, I've got stingers, I've got fangs as a predator. So what do I do as a prey species to try and ultimately stay away from that? Alright, and so you've got a whole host of things. And we're talking things like behavioral defenses, the hiding, the fleeing, being in a herd or in a school, hoping that being part of a mass of organisms helps me to survive. All right. Maybe self defense. Alarm calls maybe doesn't help me personally, but it helps the other members of my family or my own population. And then you've got more of these morphological or physiological defenses. Things like your cryptic coloring, all right, your camouflage. Here's this little guy right here, all right, but he has developed that camouflage coloring to blend into his surroundings, hoping that the predator, doesn't see him. A spermatic coloration, so something like our tree frogs here. And typically you see organisms have developed these bright colors, typically because they're poisonous. All right, so sort of taking multiple pieces and putting it together. All right, well, organism, say a bird for instance, goes after that brightly colored organism, learns that it's toxic. All right, and so then associates that bright color, that pattern, with something that's going to make me sick. All right, and so they stay away from it. Over time, evolution forces that bright coloration to be more common in the population because they're the ones not getting eaten. Okay? And then we've got mimicry, which is kind of an interesting idea. We've got your Batesian mimicry, okay, where a particular species has developed similar coloration over time to an organism that is harmful, but they themselves don't have that toxin or whatever it happens to be. But as that organism learns that the toxic one is bad for it, it associates the same pattern across all species. So one of the best examples is the monarch, which eats the milkweed. The milkweed is toxic to birds, but you have the viceroy, another butterfly, very similar coloration, but that viceroy isn't actually poisonous. Birds don't know the difference. They see that orange and black coloring, they assume it's toxic, and so both the monarch gets the benefit, they're the actual toxic ones, but so the viceroys by having that similar coloration, even though if they were to be eaten, the bird wouldn't have any issues. All right, and then we have the Mullern mimicry, where both organisms are toxic, they're unpalatable to their predators, but they both have similar colorations. So here you kind of have a dosing effect. All right, I eat one particular unpalatable species, I start to learn that that's bad, that coloration means I shouldn't eat it. I go to another species, similar coloration, I happen to eat that one, well, that one's bad too, and so now I get kind of a double dose of that pattern, that coloring is bad for me and I should stay away from it. Okay, so kind of helping each other out in that sense as well. Then you've got herbivory, which really is kind of a predator-prey relationship, but in the sense that I'm not eating another animal, now I'm an organism going after a plant, all right, or algae for that matter. Obviously, the animal or insect doing the eating is benefiting, the plant is not, all right, but just like we see coevolution between predators and prey of animal or insect or reptile species, you see a similar coevolution going on between the herbivores and the plants that they're eating. So those plants have to evolve chemical, mechanical defenses to kind of fend off their herbivores, fend off their predators in a sense. So a lot of plants have toxic chemicals so that their herbivores don't come after them, spines, prickles, all sorts of things. But as a result, those insects then will ultimately learn what's there and develop defenses against it. So that's really the heart of coevolution is my predator is going to get better at getting its prey. Prey is going to get better at getting away from its predator. So the predator has to get better at getting the prey again. And so it's very much a cyclical pattern of strengthening one species, one predator, strengthening the prey, and then so on and so forth. Symbiosis. All right, yet another type of interaction between species in a community. All right. Keep in mind that symbiosis in and of itself just means that there's some sort of relationship, and that relationship is direct and intimate with one species to another. Okay, a lot of students will frequently misuse the word symbiosis with mutualism. Okay, and mutualism is a type of symbiosis, but symbiosis also encompasses other types of relationships, like the parasitism here on the slide. All right. Parasitism is another positive-negative relationship where your parasite is ultimately going to benefit and their host is going to be harmed because that parasite is taking nutrients from its host. All right, and we can separate these parasites into two categories depending on where we find them existing in that relationship with its host. If they're endoparasites, remember endo kind of means inner, inside. So your endoparasites are things like your tapeworms, all right, your liver flukes, things that are going on inside the body of its host. Your ectoparasites, ecto kind of being outside, or in this case, external. Those are things like your lice and your ticks and that kind of idea. And these guys are living on the outside surface of their host, gathering the nutrient that they need. And parasites are kind of an interesting thing because a lot of them have very complex life cycles where they spend part of their cycle within one type of host. As they mature into another part of their life cycle, they now need another type of host. All right, and so they're constantly on the move as they kind of use up their host for one purpose, moving on to another host for something else. And a lot of parasites, the way that they function is to kind of get their host to behave in a way that increases that parasite's fitness rather than the host. So a lot of tapeworms were sort of a weight loss drug in the early 1900s because you ate this thing, you could eat all you wanted, but your body wasn't getting the nutrients the parasite was, and so it was sort of put out there as a way to lose weight. Obviously not a healthy way to do it, all right, but a mechanism nonetheless. We can also have mutualism. All right, so these are those positive relationships. Both are benefiting from the relationship. And depending on the way that relationship has evolved over time, they can be kind of obligate relationships where you remove one species from that relationship, the other one can't survive. All right, so they really are dependent on that relationship for survival. All right. Good example might be some of the bacteria that live in the guts of cattle. All right, those organisms, those bacterial species are there to help the cattle to break down the grasses and cellulose in the plants that they're eating that they would not be able to do otherwise. All right, and yet that's typically what those organisms are eating. So you take the bacteria away, all of a sudden they can't digest that stuff, and they run into a lot of issues. Very much dependent on one another. Or they can be facultative. All right. So it's helpful when they're within that mutualistic relationship, But if that species were to happen to not be there, the other one could survive without it. And then you've got commensalism. Okay, most students by this point know the definition, all right, where one species is benefiting while the other one really doesn't get a benefit out of the relationship, but they're not harmed either. But these relationships are really kind of hard to define because it's hard not to find a relationship where somebody isn't either benefiting and harming the other or benefiting both. So while we believe these sorts of relationships exist, it's not necessarily consistent from one scientist to the next as to whether or not they would define a particular relationship as commensalism versus mutualism, or depending on the situation, whether it be commensalism versus something like a parasitic relationship. Okay, so keep that in mind. We do believe they exist, but there isn't a consensus from one scientist to the next as to how to truly document these sorts of commensalism relationships. Okay. And then we have facilitation. This one doesn't typically come up frequently in sort of a introductory biology or environmental class. And what we're talking about here can be a mutualistic relationship or a commensalism relationship if you're kind of looking at who's getting benefited, who's getting harmed, who's not really getting anything. All right. And facilitation is where we take one particular species and its interaction has a positive effect on another species, but that positive effect can come from a direct relationship, which is where you'd get more of this positive, or it can be more of an indirect relationship, which is where this sort of relationship that doesn't really matter to a positive comes from. And we see facilitation a lot more frequently with plants. All right, and so the example is a black rush. It's a particular type of grass. All right, and when it's within a particular community structure, its sheer presence helps to make the soil more hospitable, nutrient-wise, so on and so forth, for other plant species to be able to exist. All right, you remove that black rush, and all of a sudden it makes it much more difficult for other plant species to come in and survive well. So that's sort of the idea there behind facilitation. So the last slide I'm going to show you for this particular part just goes back through and gives you the different types of interactions that we see. What sort of the relationship? Is it beneficial to both? Is it harmful to both? So on and so forth, which is where those plus, minuses, and zeros come from. And then just a brief sort of description or what you may think of as a definition for each of those. Make sure you're aware of these. The biggest way you're going to see these in some sort of assessment is really going to be, can you identify, based on some sort of scenario, what type of interaction is going on? All right.